Raphael continues his story to Adam and Eve. He says, "After leaving Satan, Abdiel traveled throughout the night until he arrived back at the center of heaven. When he arrived, though true night never comes to heaven, dawn was breaking through the twilight, and Abdiel could see in the morning light that all the loyal angels were preparing for war, and Abdiel knew that word of Satan's rebellion had already spread. These angels rejoiced to see Abdiel, knowing that he had not been lost and he had not betrayed them, and they brought him to see God himself. Abdiel arrives at the top of the mountain, where a gray billowing cloud appears above his head. There's a roar of wind and a flash of lightning, and then instead of thunder, he hears the calm voice of God. "Well done, my son," God says. "You have stood firm, though all the forces of Satan were against you. You will be rewarded for your bravery." Satan stands firm, though all the forces of heaven are against him, and he will be punished for his brazenness. The hard part is over, Abdiel. Now all that's left is to defeat Satan in this war. So God calls to his archangels. "Michael, Gabriel," God says, "take your troops and meet Satan on the field of battle. Pursue them until you have chased them down into the pits of hell, where they will be held captive forevermore." God finished speaking, and only then did the thunder crash, the sound of his wrath echoing throughout heaven. At this signal, his angels began their march to war, and to prevent them from being slowed down by the terrain, they marched in the air, high above, their legs doing a kind of bicycle motion. They marched, and at last they saw Satan's own troops in the distance, their spears glinting. Satan had hoped to catch us unawares and steal God's throne, but we intercepted him. The two armies faced off. This was the first time war was ever invented, so I kept hearing things like, "Isn't this weird?" Satan drove up to the front lines in his golden chariot and disembarked, and when brave little Abdiel saw him in his armor, he trembled with fear. Brave little Abdiel says to himself, "Boy, Satan still seems really scary. But if I defeated him in argument, that means I can also defeat him in battle." So Abdiel steps forward and calls out, "Satan, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I know you meant to invade heaven and conquer it without a contest. But you know, God could defeat you by snuffing you out between two of his fingers. But he doesn't even have to do that. He sent me, Abdiel, along with all my friends here to stop you." Satan replies, "Abdiel, my old friend, how fortunate that we should meet again after you ran away. I was hoping I would have the chance to see you once more and take my revenge after you betrayed our cause. Did you intend to gain glory and victory by changing sides? If so, you may be disappointed. After all, consider which of these two sides is more motivated. My side is fighting for our liberty, while yours is made up of those who are content to serve, those who are happy to sing and dance before God." Abdiel replied, "Wrong. It is wise and just to serve God and his perfect adult Son. It is only servitude to serve one who is unworthy, the way your followers are enthralled to you, or the way you are enthralled to yourself. But I'm not here to hear your opinion, Satan. I'm here to send you to hell." And after speaking, Abdiel swung his sword in a high arc, hitting Satan in the head, knocking his helmet off and knocking him back 10 paces. To see Satan stumble like that, we all gave a cheer. Then someone blew a trumpet and we rushed into battle. What I remember most about it is the noise, the sound of darts whizzing by, the clang of metal on metal, and most of all the screams that never stopped. These were millions of powerful, courageous, ferocious beings fighting with all their might, If it had happened on Earth, the very planet would have been shaken off of its axis. Even as it was, only the physical presence of God himself prevented heaven from being torn apart. Raphael continues his story. All warriors, on both sides, fought with bravery and valor that day. Sometimes on the ground, sometimes in the air in a kind of angelic dogfight. The battle seemed evenly matched all day, until Satan caught sight of Michael with his huge sword, fighting off 10 rebel angels at once, and about to smite all of them. So Satan stepped into the fray, holding his great broad shield aloft, trying to protect his soldiers. Michael turned toward him, and he saw an opportunity here to end the whole war at once, so he gladly accepted the fight. Michael says to Satan, "You've introduced a lot of new ideas here. War, strife, malice, misery, and it kind of pisses me off. I'm not going to let your evil fester here in heaven, Satan. No, I will cast you out, and I will chase you all the way to hell. And I will not let anything stop me unless God himself destroys you first." Satan replied, "You speak quite aggressively, Michael, but if you can't back your words up with deeds, you might as well write them on the wind or on the rushing water. You haven't defeated a single one of my angels. Even those who have fallen get right back up to fight again, and I promise you this, before you drive me out of heaven, I will turn this place into a hell." After that, there were no more words. It's hard for me to describe what their fight was like, in terms you can understand. Their fiery swords blazed in circles through the air, and their golden shields gleamed like the sun. Try to imagine if 2 planets, or even 2 constellations were fighting. That'll give you just the tiniest bit of an idea of what it was like when Michael and Satan fought. Michael swung his sword downward, hoping to end the war in a single blow, but Satan, with quick reflexes, raised his own sword to block it. The 2 were evenly matched, and who's to say who would have prevailed? But God hardened the metal in Michael's sword so that nothing could withstand it, and it cleaved clean through Satan's sword and gashed him down the side. Satan bled, and he felt pain for the first time. His comrades rushed to put him on their shields and take him back to his chariot. The whole way back, he screamed, not so much in pain, but feeling the shame of having been defeated, at least partially, by one he didn't think to be an equal. Just as angels are able to change their shape at will, in the same way they can sew up their own wounds magically. So in his chariot, Satan healed himself quickly. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, other great deeds were being done. Gabriel defeated Moloch. Remember Moloch? He's the warlike demon from Book 2 who wanted to invade heaven. Moloch had had a few nasty words for Gabriel and promised to chain him to the back of his chariot and ride around the gates of heaven. But by the time Gabriel was done with him, Moloch could do nothing but scream. Elsewhere, Uriel and Raphael, that is, yours truly, squared off against a couple of huge diamond-armored rebel angels, and we knocked them flat on their backs. Even brave little Abdiel defeated a couple of evil cherubim. Raphael continues, "My fellow compatriots and I did many other great and wondrous deeds on the battlefield that day, so many that it would take a full year to recount them all. But I will not, for we angels do not like to boast. To be fair, Satan and his followers also fought well, but I will not honor those wicked ones by praising them. And by the end of that first day of battle, the rebels were routed, each one wounded or exhausting, in a disorganized retreat across heaven, while we, the loyal ones, buoyed by the strength of God's favor, pursued them relentlessly. When night came to heaven, we had to call off our pursuit of Satan. The terrible noise of battle finally died down, and as we made camp, we were glad for the rest. Meanwhile, Satan called his advisors in for a war council. He said, 'I'd like to congratulate you all on getting through this first day of battle. You held your own against an army that was thought to be invincible. Perhaps they are not so. Perhaps you are in pain. I am myself. Savor that pain, because it means that you are alive, and that while God may have thrown his best at you, he did not destroy you. He could not destroy you. Satan continued, what we need to do is find something to turn the tide of battle in our favor. Perhaps a new weapon. We must come up with a new plan before the night is out. Satan sat down, and one of his lieutenants stood up, Nisroch, his face smudged with blood and dirt. Nisroch said, our soldiers have been put through the ringer. I mean pain. I mean pain strongly. And the worst part of it is, our enemies barely seem to have been touched at all. You say we'll come up with a new plan, and if you can, I'm all for it. But if not, we can't take much more of this. Satan answered, I have an observation. We all enjoy the visible wonders of heaven, the fruits and fields and flowers that are available to all. But you may not know, there are more wonders to be found under the earth. Saltpeter and sulfur, that can be used to make gunpowder, that can be used to fire cannons, that can be used to break through the enemy lines. They will make such a tremendous boom that they will out-thunder the thunderer himself and put God's soldiers to flight. It is not difficult to make. We can get it done this very night and be ready for battle tomorrow morning. So take heart. All is not lost. It is the mark of a certain kind of genius that once they have solved a problem, no matter how difficult, they make the solution seem obvious. So as Satan explained his plans for the artillery, his lieutenants took heart to be sure, but they gave him no credit, for each one secretly thought that he could have come up with it himself. They set to work immediately, mining minerals for gunpowder, building the cannons, and casting the cannonballs from molten iron. They worked all through the night, almost silently, to avoid arousing any suspicion. Morning came. The trumpets blew reveille. We awoke and armored ourselves for battle. We didn't know what state we would find Satan's army in, so we sent out scouts to investigate. The first of those scouts to return was Raphael, well known as the swiftest of all angels. Raphael reported, Satan has not fled. In fact, his troops are already on the march, slow-moving and foreboding like a storm cloud. So you better get yourselves ready to fight, for they mean to rain arrows down upon you. So we did, and as we advanced, we soon caught sight of Satan's army in formation. What we didn't know is that these formations hid their secret weapon. The two armies faced each other. We heard Satan bellow out, "Front lines, spread out and showed God's troops our peace offering. I'm sure it's going to blow them away." And they did. The soldiers in front split off to the left and right, revealing what appeared to be 3 giant hollow metal columns on wheels. Behind each one there was an angel holding a torch. We didn't know what to make of any of it. Then at Satan's signal, each of these angels held the torch to something at the back of their column. The cannons exploded with smoke and noise and cannonballs chained together. Our front lines were leveled. Those of us who were left standing behind them didn't know what to do. We couldn't withstand another such blast, especially because we were weighed down with our heavy armor. We wanted to rush the enemy lines, but they had another set of cannons ready to go. Satan called out across the battle lines, "Why, our enemies are behaving quite strangely. We sent them our terms of peace, and the thought of a truce must make them joyful, because they are dancing around, and yet this dance seems to consist mainly of falling down. Belial replied, patting a cannon, "Yes, the terms we gave them were weighty and forceful, but they don't seem to be taking them quite seriously. They can hardly stand up from laughing so hard. Perhaps another round of negotiations will help." They mocked us in this fashion for quite some time, while we were able to regroup and find a way to oppose their hellish machinery. Raphael continues, "I'm not ashamed to say that we threw down our weapons and ran. We couldn't withstand the force of Satan's cannons, so we escaped beyond their range of fire. Then, with strength given us by God, we picked up the very hills from the ground and hurled them at the rebel army, burying their weapons, and soon burying the soldiers themselves. They were trapped, weighed down and crushed by their own armor. Those who got free began throwing the hills back at us, so the dirt and rocks flew through the air, blotting out the sky and leaving us mostly in darkness. The fighting was horrendous. The ground itself trembled and seemed on the verge of falling apart. But meanwhile, God, who had been watching the whole thing from far away, turned to his son and said, 'Fascinating. These two sides have been fighting for 2 days. 2 days, and neither side seems to have an advantage. Angels will be angels, I suppose. Only now they are tearing apart the very landscape of heaven. We have to put a stop to this. Bodily harm is one thing, but I cannot abide property damage.' God said, 'This hullabaloo has gone on long enough. I'm subbing you in, my son, so that you can end this war once and for all, and all the glory will be yours. Take my thunderbolts, and my armor, and my sword. Make me proud, son.' And with that, God beamed at his son, and the son beamed back at his father. God's son says, 'Father, all I want is to make you proud. So if you give me this power, I will use it as your vessel. Loving the ones you love, hating the ones you hate, and destroying those you want destroyed. I will pluck out evil wherever I find it, so that heaven is filled only with those who sincerely praise and obey you.' God's son climbed into his father's chariot and said, 'Let's drive.' Morning of the 3rd day of battle was breaking as he peeled out. The chariot was pulled by 4 angels. It had flame decals painted on the side, and its chassis was made from crystal. He sat in the driver's seat, a throne made from sapphires. He carried with him his father's bow and thunderbolt arrows, and he wore his father's armor inlaid with precious stones. As he flew across the sky toward the battle lines, God's son was accompanied by his retinue of 20,000 more chariots. When the chariot rolled up on the battlefield, we all recognized it by the flame decals on the side. God's son stepped out, and Michael gave up command of the troops to him without a complaint. Then the son walked to the front lines, and he looked out at the torn-up landscape from the battle, and he called out to it, and instantly the land smoothed itself out, and the hills returned to their proper places. But the rebel angels were not overawed by this. They did not capitulate. Instead, their hearts were hardened, and they vowed to make one last stand in battle. God's son says to his army, 'Stand back. This is my fight. You've done well, but I'm the one that the rebel army has a problem with, because my father chose to honor me over Satan. Strength seems to be the only thing that Satan respects. Therefore, I will take on the entire army, one against a multitude, and we will see who proves the stronger.' God's son drove his chariot straight at the opposing army, so fast that it caused a sonic boom that shook the heavens. As he rode, he had an expression that was mournful yet determined. Arriving in their midst, he reached into his quiver and threw 10,000 thunderbolts that caused the rebel angels to drop their weapons. They were terrified, and in that moment they were defeated. Yet for all that, the son did not even use his full strength, for his intention was not to destroy these angels, but merely to drive them away from heaven. The Son of God blasted a hole in the walls of heaven and drove the rebel angels through it with his thunderbolts. They were more afraid of what was behind them than what was ahead, so they willingly jumped out into the nothingness. For 9 days they fell. Chaos screamed as he watched them pass through his kingdom. Hell itself saw them coming and wanted no part of it, so it tried to escape from its own foundations, but it was held fast. Finally they landed, and the gates of hell closed behind them, trapping them in a fiery prison. Meanwhile, the broken wall in heaven repaired itself, like wounded flesh knitting back together. And so, Raphael says, the Messiah turned his chariot around and returned to his army. They all gave out a great cheer when they saw him, and sang songs of Hosanna and held palm fronds overhead, so that his pathway would be shaded. Then he traveled to the right hand of his Father and sat in a throne, where he sits in bliss even now. And Raphael concludes, remember this story well, Adam. Remember what happens to those who disobey, and tell Eve as well. Remember that Satan is still out there, plotting his revenge. He wants to tempt you into disobeying God so that you can share his own fate. But remember, you can, and you must stand firm where he fell.